Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Pepe Jijon TyOxidator Wash Processed Ecuador from Hydrangea Coffee Roasters. And there's the bag right there. And Hydrangea, based out of Berkeley, California. And this is their third ever appearance on this channel, having recently reviewed their Wave Natural Sidra version of this coffee. And this is actually the second time this specific Pepe coffee has appeared on this channel, having reviewed Manhattan Coffee Roasters version of this coffee last year. And I enjoyed Manhattan's version so much that it ended up being our #1 favorite coffee from the entirety of 2022. So it's safe to say the expectations for this coffee were extremely high, as I do know what it is capable of. Definitely looking forward to discussing this one, as this right here is day 44. And recipe we went with for this coffee was a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 99 degrees Celsius, about 210 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the Chemex, which indicates a more medium grind. Roast profile for this coffee, relative to Manhattan's version, which was a very light coffee, this one definitely has a fair bit more development to it, as there's a very noticeable difference between the two coffees. I feel like a lot of people might more closely align this one in terms of a slightly less developed light medium in terms of that roast profile. But once again, relatively speaking, you can definitely tell that there's a fair bit more development to this one when compared to Manhattan's version of this coffee. With that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 13, first impression. Ran it through the V60 and it was extremely reminiscent of the early days of Pepe Jijon from Manhattan, as it did have a pretty herbal and red forward cup with a lingering sweetness underneath. The sweetness did offer immense potential, as there was a slightly sugary aspect to the cup, but for the most part it did bring back memories of one of my favorite coffees ever. Day 17, ran it through the Chemex, and it was a very different second impression, as it seemed to accentuate a lot more of the development to the cup, as it felt a little bit more heavy and textured. I can see the cranberry note that's listed on here, as there was a very rich red fruit to the cup and a very herbal complexity as well. So interesting second impression, very different from the first time trying it. But we continue on to day 21, as I ran it through the April dripper, and the cup is yet again a bit more robust and intense, as it offered a very red forward cup in a more herbal sense with some slightly darker fruits. There's a strong brown candied sweetness underneath, also this slight earthiness to the cup. So once again, picking up a lot of different things. It's a pretty complex coffee. It's been interesting up to this point, and it's definitely going to change from this point going forward as well. Day 25, back through the V60 with higher temperatures, and the cup continues skewing in a much more strong and robust manner, with a heavy emphasis on the plum and cranberry characteristics, which are two notes that they do have listed on here. Sweet and bright as well, and there was a lot of brightness to the cup, so it was once again pretty interesting. Honestly, going into this coffee, seeing the notes that they had listed on here, I was a little skeptical given my previous experience with this specific Pepe coffee. I'm like, how are they going to get these specific notes? I can see a lot of the red characteristics that were present in Manhattan's version. This one seems to be very far removed from that experience, and after a couple of impressions, I'm like, actually, this is pretty spot on. This is kind of what I'm experiencing with this coffee, which was kind of interesting. But we continue on to day 29, as the coffee took a drastic change for the positive, as it was surprisingly fresh stone fruit forward, as the listed plum became the most dominant component in this coffee. The heavier qualities dissipated ever so slightly, with a stronger focus on those fresher fruits. And what happened was I made those same higher, what's the word I'm looking for? Higher extraction adjustments, and adjusting those to the Chemex as well. That really did seem to accentuate a lot of those fresh fruit aspects within this coffee, and it was a really positive experience on this day 29. So I was actually really happy with the way that this coffee went, even though it was quite a bit different from Manhattan's version of this Pepe coffee. Day 32, ran it through the V60, and there is a slight bit more of those tart red fruit aspects. The listed cranberry felt apt, as it did offer a little bit more in the herbal aspect as well. Dark fresh fruit aspect prominent through the V60, more so than it had been earlier, but not quite to the same extent as the Chemex. For whatever reason, the Chemex really seemed to accentuate a lot of those fresh fruit characteristics in a very clean and pronounced manner, and I really enjoyed that. There's a bit more brightness to the cup, but honestly, that fresh fruit was a defining factor for me with the Chemex, so on day 36, went right back to that. And one thing I noticed from day 36, and this is kind of interesting, it's present yet again in today's cup, and it was present in the day 40 cup, is that it has a very noticeable, what I would describe as SpaghettiOs aroma to it. And once again, I mentioned that I watched Brian and Bill discussing this coffee, and Brian mentioned quite a bit that it did have like a tomato-like aspect. Honestly, for me, it actually very much smells like SpaghettiOs, though the cup doesn't necessarily yield those same savory qualities. It's ever so slight within the cup itself, as it seems to offer a lot more of the tart berries on the forefront, with a bunch of the wonderfully clean fresh fruit qualities on the back end of the cup, with plenty of the listed brightness to the cup as it does cool as well. And once again, I was really enjoying a lot of those fresh fruit aspects to this one. It's just really interesting how strong the aroma is within this coffee, but that's not different from the other Pepe coffee, as Manhattan's version of this coffee also offers a very interesting aroma to it. Day 40, the coffee has seemed to settle down a bit, as it's still offering a fair bit of the herbal aspects as well as a fair bit of those stronger tart berry aspects to it as well. The fresh fruit remains every bit as defined and pronounced. It's still quite prominent and present here on day 34, but a lot of the other qualities, those kind of extra more robust qualities, have been toned down since, so I was actually quite enjoying the way that this coffee had changed over time with the adjustments that we had made. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. All right, and we have quite a few level 4s. So we will start with the cleanliness, level 4. Yes, and that's actually mirroring exactly what we experienced from Manhattan's version of this coffee, as it's, interestingly, I would say maybe at times a bit more defined. Manhattan's version wasn't necessarily the most defined coffee. It was a little bit more of a kind of subtle and complex coffee, but this one right here did have a very pronounced and defined characteristic profile to it, which is something we'll probably get to a little later. The finish, level 4. Yes, it didn't necessarily have the most long-lasting finish, not to the point where it was overbearing in any specific sense. If anything, it was actually more of that wonderfully enjoyable finish that I do enjoy. So in our previous review of one of Hydrangea's coffees, I said that it was overbearing, and the sweetness, which was also at a level 4, was a type of sweetness I didn't enjoy. That's why you must take these tasting wheels all into context, as this one right here was much more of the sweetness that I do enjoy. It was a lot more in line with those fresh fruit aspects to it. Very sweet in that sense, in that capacity, so very much enjoyed the sweetness that was present within this coffee. Acidity, level 4. Yes, it was bright throughout, right from start to finish, and I don't think I necessarily have too much to say on that at times. These coffees specifically have been reminiscent of like the Kenyan-like brightness to them, so this one right here, while it may not have necessarily been to that extent, there was a fair bit of this kind of red fruit brightness to it in general. And that was in line with the berry notes, which we have listed right there at the level 4. And once again, they do have a cranberry listed on here. I was actually very skeptical. I mentioned that earlier. Was still kind of skeptical for the majority of the time drinking it, but I'm like, this is actually very pronounced in this coffee, way more so than it was in Manhattan's version of this coffee. So take that for what you will, but the berry aspects were very much noticeable. And while they weren't maybe quite as pronounced for me as the stone fruits towards the end, I could definitely say that they were quite present throughout, and they were very much in line with the acidity as well, as those two things seem to go hand in hand, giving it a slight Kenyan-like characteristic. Stone fruit, level 4. Yes, and that's something that I mentioned, and once I was able to get that, I honed in on that, and that's what our recipe really seemed to focus on and tried to accentuate, was the stone fruit characteristics, because the plum in this is beautiful, and it's reminiscent of some of the plum-like characteristics I've experienced from Coffea Circular's coffees, most specifically that Ruby Batian, which really sets that coffee apart. That was very much present within this one as well, and this is actually probably the most pronounced and prominent note I was able to experience from this coffee, as it was very well defined when I was able to get it just right. So very happy with that stone fruit. That's why I've spent so much time discussing it. It was wonderful within this coffee. Savoriness, level 4. Possibly a little high, and I do want to focus on the fact that I don't necessarily think that this was like a tomato-like savoriness, but rather that very strong herbal savoriness that was present within it. And I do think that they have a hibiscus note listed on here. They don't. So jasmine, plum, and cranberry. So I feel like I'm overselling a note that wasn't necessarily on here. Nonetheless, there was a very strong red floral note to this one as well, and that's actually where I lumped the savory aspect into this coffee. As mentioned, the aroma does yield a very strong savory component to it, and that might have played a role in it scoring as high as it did. But yeah, I wouldn't necessarily say an overly tomato-y coffee in general. I didn't experience a lot of that from Manhattan's version of this coffee either, so take that for what you will. Then we have a bunch of level 3s. We'll start with the florality, which kind of goes with what I was mentioning. Yes, it did have a little bit more of that floral aspect. It is interesting, jasmine. I did not experience much of that in this coffee. If anything, I would say it was a little bit more in line with that hibiscus, even a rose-like characteristic to this one. So I guess differences in agreement on that. Citrus fruit, level 4. Yes, there was a slight citric bright quality to this one, and I don't necessarily think I have too much to say, not a specifically or particularly defined aspect in that sense. Caramel, level 3. Yes, and that's one thing maybe I was hoping or expecting to get a lot more out of when it came to this coffee, because that was the most pronounced characteristic with Manhattan's version of this coffee, and that's what really set that one apart, was that brown candied sweetness, which like shot up in that coffee to a unbelievable level. And that's something I've experienced a lot from these Mejorado coffees, but this one really didn't seem to go in that direction, which is kind of interesting to me. It did have a candied sweet aspect to it, but not to the same level as a lot of the other Mejorado coffees I have experienced. Bitterness, level 3. Yes, and that actually goes in line with those very tart berry aspects that's present within this one, so I agree with that. And then the last thing I think worth discussing is the body at a level 2. This one was made with the Chemex, so I don't think that'll come as much of a surprise, but yeah, for the most part, I think this is a pretty good tasting wheel. I think it's a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee, I did enjoy it, and that's still a really nice positive given that I went into it with some very high expectations, and this coffee turned out to be a lot different from what I was expecting, and I think going into it, I was expecting somewhat of a similar version of Manhattan's version of this coffee. But that's what's so interesting, because I know that both of these coffees were roasted with the Probat, so I think it goes to show what maybe a change in roasting style will end up doing to a coffee, because in theory, they both would have been, well, they should have had very similar characteristics to them, but these seem like two entirely different coffees. If you would have served me a bunch of Mejorado coffees on a table, maybe some of the Felipe Luzons we've reviewed earlier this year, just some of the other ones, then I would actually have a very hard time differentiating which ones were the TyOxidator wash processed coffees, because Manhattan's version went in one specific direction, this very strong sugary sweet component, and this one right here went a lot more in terms of the red fruit direction. So very different coffees, and that's just what I really wanted to focus on with this one, because I'm not necessarily saying it was bad. If anything, I would say the best thing about this coffee was that it was a lot more approachable than Manhattan's version of this coffee. A lot of people complain about Manhattan's version because they had a very tough time getting that one right, but I feel like this one was actually a lot easier to get right. And I'm going to go back to the comments that Bill made on our Letty Bermudez review, where he said that it felt easier to dial in the coffees if there's a little bit more development to them. And that's entirely what might have happened with this one right here, because I didn't have as difficult of a time figuring this coffee out. I had a very difficult time with Manhattan's version of this coffee, but I got this one right pretty early, really enjoyed what I was experiencing from it and seemed to focus on that. And while it may not have been to the same level of enjoyment as I had from Manhattan's version, the type of enjoyment I had from this one, most specifically that sweet stone fruit aspect, was a really nice positive. So I very much enjoyed this coffee. It's definitely on the more enjoyable side of coffees I have had from Hydrangea in general, though there have been some other Pepe coffees I've enjoyed a little bit more, as they've been a little bit more in line with my preferences. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to. This one, interestingly, has a lot of Kenyan-like aspects to it, as I've experienced a fair bit of Kenyans that also offer a lot of these same characteristics to them. So this one does lend itself a little bit more towards the Kenyan drinkers, as it does offer a fair bit of that brightness while still being accompanied by a great level of sweetness as well. Some more red profile to this one, so that's just kind of the first start I would go with. But also, it does offer some great depth and complexity. Of course, there's great sweetness to it. I think I've been underselling how much sweetness there is, as there was an abundance of that throughout the entirety of this coffee. And I honestly think that's the best way I can direct somebody for this one, and the best way I can leave this review. If you've by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Pepe Jijon TyOxidator Wash Processed Ecuador from Hydrangea Coffee Roasters. Thank you for watching.